This morning I want to uncover what I believe to be a lost discipline of both our society and of our church. And I don't mean lost in the typical sense. It's not as though nobody practices it. In fact, a lot of people actually do. It's lost in the way that no one intentionally practices it. We may do it accidentally without knowing, but not very many of us are aware that we are doing it. And I think in order for us to harness this discipline, to be able to use it most effectively, we need to be aware of what it is and be able to intentionally practice it. Allow me to give you a few examples of unintentionally practicing this. My family and I have a very strange tradition, and that is we will always be the last people to exit a movie theatre. If we're at the movies, we will wait till all of the end credits have rolled out, until the lights are completely on, until we will leave the cinema. Most people are already up and out by the time the first credit comes up, but we will stay for the entirety of the time. And the reason is, for the last 2 hours, we've become emotionally invested in this character. We've seen their journey, we've empathized with their struggles, we've seen them overcome evil. We've had this music arousing us and making us feel all victorious and triumphant. We've seen beautiful cinematography. It's a lot of information to consume in 2 hours. And just staying in the end credits gives this opportunity, this time to be able to release the tension that we've just built up for the last 2 hours. It allows for this opportunity to be able to just stop, to be able to think, reflect, and meditate on what we've just seen for the past 2 hours. Similarly, at the beginning of this year, I noticed that I unintentionally practiced this discipline as well. I found that if ever I had a lot of assignments or a lot of pressure on me, my immediate instinct was always go and find the nearest piano. That was just my go-to thing to do. Because I found that whenever I played piano for a bit, whatever stress or whatever anxiousness I was feeling seemed to just disappear just after playing piano for a little bit. And so here I was, again, unintentionally practicing this discipline. So what is this discipline that seems to be all but lost? It's the discipline of catharsis. Man, that formatting, great. It's the discipline of catharsis. And what is catharsis? Catharsis is merely the process of releasing and thereby providing relief from strong or oppressed emotions. So for example, as I said, my family and I have become emotionally invested in this movie, and then the end credits just gives that time to release yourself of all the emotions you've just built up. Or similarly, for playing the piano, just having a time to not think about what I was doing and to just be able to release the stress and anxiety that I was going through is in and of itself a method of catharsis. So catharsis is purely just releasing yourself of the emotions that you're carrying around. Now, why have we all but lost this idea in our society? I think it ultimately comes down to the fact that we live in a culture that very much promotes the idea, if you don't want to ever be bored, you will never have to be. You can constantly be doing something and constantly distracting yourself, and catharsis demands that you set aside a time where you're not doing anything and just think and reflect and meditate. So for example, some people, as soon as the last shot of the movie plays and the first end credit slide comes up, some people are already up out of the movies. All right, what can I do next? What's the next thing to distract myself? I know I'm equally guilty of this. If ever I'm not doing something during the day, my immediate instinct is to just grab out my phone and start doing something, just to fill in space. We live in a culture where if you don't want to ever not be doing something, you can easily find a distraction to keep yourself occupied. And so that's why I think many of us aren't practicing this idea or this discipline of catharsis, because catharsis demands that for a moment we just stop, we slow down, and we don't do anything for a short period of time. But what I think is perhaps more frightening than catharsis being lost in our culture is the fact that it has effectively been lost in our church, I believe. Catharsis is also a spiritual discipline when we look in the Bible and in the biblical text, but unfortunately we seem to have forgotten to practice it. And catharsis comes under what we would refer to as mental and emotional needs. We understand that the human body is comprised of body, mind, and spirit, and from those three components, we have a variety of different needs. So, for example, we all have physical needs, and we're really good at meeting people's physical needs. We as a church have an awesome health message that God has given us: how to eat correctly, how to live a balanced lifestyle, the importance of exercise, and all those sorts of great things. We're really good at meeting people's physical needs. We're also really good at meeting people's spiritual needs. I guarantee you go along the Central Coast today, you'll be getting a spiritually rich sermon from whoever's preaching. We have Bible studies on basically every topic under the sun. We have prophecy seminars. We are really good at meeting people's spiritual needs. We're also great at meeting people's social needs. We give not only the opportunity to have fellowship and meet here on a Sabbath, but we have small groups during the week, prayer groups. And we encourage with the congregation, go out, bring your friends into the church, evangelize by meeting people and being social. We're really good at meeting social needs. But I think when it comes to meeting people's mental and emotional needs, we seem to be a bit deficient. We don't seem to do a whole lot in this area. It's almost as if when we hear that somebody's going through some mental or emotional troubles, we immediately sort of tense up, and we often think it's a little bit too personal, or it's a bit taboo to talk about what you're thinking and what you're feeling. We don't seem to properly address these mental and emotional needs. And in fact, unfortunately, some young people are even brought up into the church with, I think, a very wrong mentality, and that is that all emotions are inherently sinful. I find that to be very problematic and very unbiblical. Are there sinful emotions? Okay, lust, selfishness, greed, jealousy. All right, these are sinful things, right? But to say that all of them are, and make a blanket statement like that, neglects emotions such as love or joy and peace. Having emotions is part of being human. It's what makes us free moral agents. And I would say it even is an intrinsic part of us being made in the image of God. When you read throughout the Bible, you see God constantly expressing a variety of emotions. He is righteously angry at the injustice and at the wicked. He loves his people unconditionally. He's upset when his people leave him, but then he's filled with joy when they return to him. All throughout the Bible, God is expressing these same emotions. And so I think what we need to do is reevaluate this idea of how we address people's mental and emotional needs in the church. We can't neglect that they're not there. Part of being human is having these emotions and learning how to deal and process with them. But why is it so important to take care of these needs specifically? Surely, it wouldn't be too bad if we neglected just one of the three. 3 for 4 isn't bad. The problem with the 3 for 4 idea is that all it takes is for one to be neglected for all the other aspects of your life to suffer. Think of it this way. Let's say you've got a splinter in your finger. Your feet are fine, your stomach and your chest is fine, your head's fine, but you've got this annoying splinter in your finger. How effective do you think you're going to be working throughout the day? Probably not that effective. You're going to be constantly distracted by this annoying splinter in your finger. The rest of your body is completely fine, but all it takes is for one part of the body to be neglected for the rest of the body to suffer. In the same way, if we're not taking care of our mental and emotional needs, our physical life, our spiritual life, and our social life also begin to suffer as a result. And so we can't have this mentality that they're all going to take care of themselves. We need to make sure to not neglect all of them, but instead to have a focus on meeting all of these needs. And this morning I want to be able to just specifically focus on this idea of the mental and emotional needs that we too often neglect. And I think one way that we can start to improve on this in this area in our personal lives is to begin by practicing this spiritual discipline of catharsis. Okay, but why is catharsis so necessary? It sounds nice, the releasing of emotions. It sounds like a very great idea, but why is it so important to our spiritual lives? If I could just illustrate this for a second. If I could just get everyone to close their eyes for a second. Don't worry, we're not going to do any yoga or anything. We're just going to breathe. It's biblical. So if I could just get you just to take a big, deep breath in And then just breathe out. Okay, we're going to do that again. This time, as you breathe in, I just want you to tense up your shoulders, and then when you breathe out, just let them slowly drop back down to your side. So if you just breathe in, and then breathe out. All right, you can open your eyes. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you, I'm sure we've all been asked to do a simple exercise like that a lot of times. But what I find interesting is every time you do it, even though you've probably done that stacks of times before, it's always nice to just intentionally take a deep breath in and then take a deep breath out. It always feels nice to do it. And catharsis works in the exact same way. In the same way that you build up this tension by taking a deep breath in, catharsis is the method of taking that deep breath out, of releasing yourself of that emotion. Now, I mentioned that most of us probably unintentionally practice this discipline, right? And I know for me, the way that I did it was I would save my catharsis for one day of the week, and that was it. And that was every time I'd come to church. I'd go throughout the whole week, keeping this breath in, never breathing out, and then I'd come to church and then breathe out. I'd say, all right, God, now that I'm at church, you can have all the emotions and all the things that I've been dealing with this week. Now you can have it. Imagine if we attended our other needs with the same mentality. Let's say with our physical needs, you only ate food on Sabbaths. Or your spiritual needs, you only read your Bible when it came around to Sabbath. Or social needs, you just didn't interact with anyone during the week except on Sabbath. We would say that is a completely unsustainable lifestyle. You can't just assign these needs to one day of the week. It needs to be a daily thing that we do. Or even consider in a day how much time we dedicate to each of these needs. Let's say physical needs, let's say you eat half an hour at each meal. That's an hour and a half spent on physical needs. Spiritual needs, let's say you spend half an hour in the morning, half an hour at night, reading, praying, doing devotions. That's an hour on spiritual needs. Let's say you have a job, you work 9 to 5, you are interacting with people all day. So basically half your day is spent meeting social needs. How much time in a day do we dedicate to attending to our mental and emotional needs? I would say, and I know this is speaking from personal experience, we don't often dedicate a great deal of time to it. And we often fall into this trap of, well, I don't have to do it every day. I can just, put it on Sabbath and I can tell God all about it during the week. But again, if we had that same mentality with the other needs, we would say it's completely unsustainable. And in the same way, for us to not deal with these emotions that we accumulate throughout the day, to not experience that catharsis, it's equally as unhealthy. I know because from personal experience, during my earlier teenage years, my devotional life was pretty lax. It wasn't that I didn't love God or anything like that. I loved God and I wanted to have a relationship with Him, but it was just so hard to not do something. As I said, if you don't ever want to be bored, you can always be distracted. And that's completely what I did during my early teenage years. I was always doing something else, and I found it hard to dedicate time to just stop, to think, to reflect, and to meditate. And so I'd go long periods of time without, telling God what I was going through. And then I decide to myself, one day, okay, tonight's the night. I'm going to tell God all the things I've been thinking and feeling lately. Tonight's the night. So I get down at my bed, kneel down, and then all of a sudden this absolute mess of emotions would come out because I've been bottling up all these things for a prolonged period of time. And so at one point I'd be crying and saying, God, I'm so sorry, I haven't talked to you in a while. But then I'd thank God and be happy because of all the blessings He's given me. And then I'd cry some more and say, oh, but God, I don't deserve these blessings. And then I'd be saying, God, I'm confused. What's your will for my life? And all these different things that I've been thinking about, I'd bottled up for ages and thought to myself, it's okay, I can put it off and prolong this idea of catharsis. But essentially all I'd been doing was holding that deep breath in and then expecting for the breath out to be relaxful and restful. If we keep it in, it really does harm to our lives. I think if we don't notice it consciously, even subconsciously, we carry around these burdens with us when we don't release whatever it is that we're feeling and giving it over to God. We carry around these burdens subconsciously or consciously, and they just weigh down on our lives. And I think that's why we need to practice this as a daily discipline. At the end of each day, be able to come to God and give over to Him whatever it is that we're experiencing, whatever emotions it is we're feeling, give it over to Him. Take that breath out and be able to experience that peace that comes as a result. So let's have a look at some biblical examples of catharsis. Let's turn to Psalms chapter 51. As we look through the Bible, we see all the time people coming to God and just expressing whatever it is they're feeling or whatever it is they're thinking, and they hand over their emotions to God in order to release themselves of what they're thinking, to release themselves of these burdens that they're carrying around. And as we go through these, I'd like for you to see if you can turn on that little empathy switch. See if you can empathize with what these different people are going through as we look at these texts. See if you can feel what they feel and just feel the raw emotion that they're going through as they express to God how they're feeling. What I like about the book of Psalms is it's essentially one enormous book of catharsis. It's the biggest book in the Bible, and it's dedicated to the spiritual discipline of releasing your emotions and giving them over to God. No matter what author you're reading, they're always telling God how they're feeling and how they're thinking, and they're just putting onto a page and through poetry and song how they're feeling to God. So let's have a look at Psalm 51 and see if you can discern what type of emotion David is expressing here. Beginning in verse 1. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you, you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight, that you may be found just when you speak, and blameless when you judge. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. Behold, you desire truth in the inward parts, and in the hidden part you will make me to know wisdom. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. This is right after David has committed some heinous sins, and he's feeling this regret and remorse. He's feeling this burden of guilt on his shoulders. And so what does he do? He comes to God in repentance and says, God, I need you to take this burden off me. He comes to God asking for forgiveness, releasing himself of these emotions of remorse and guilt that he's feeling. He gives it over to God and says, God, grant me forgiveness and grant me the peace that I need right now. Let's have a look at the book of Lamentations. It'll be quite self-evident as to what emotion is being expressed here. But I just find it interesting, again, that another individual expresses their emotions to God in written poetry form. The book of Lamentations is actually an acrostic poem, and so essentially the prophet Jeremiah is expressing his sadness to God from A to Z. He's giving every single way in which he is feeling at the moment to God through this poem. Let's read verse 11 together. My eyes fail with tears. My heart is troubled. My bile is poured out in the ground because of the destruction of the daughter of my people, because the children and the infants faint in the streets of the city. Jerusalem's just been destroyed. Jeremiah is at his lowest points, and he basically says to God, God, my eyes fail with tears. I just can't stop crying over this. And so he takes it to God and he writes down how he's feeling to God in this acrostic poem and essentially hands over this feeling of lament to God. But then my favorite passage is found in verse 22 of chapter 3. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 22. And in amongst this acrostic poem of absolute lament and sadness, Jeremiah also expresses one other emotion. Let's begin in verse 22. Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. So in amongst all this lament, we see for just a glimmer, a little glimpse of hope also comes out in Jeremiah, pouring out his emotions to God. He says, God, things are really bad now. I'm not feeling great at all. But I have this small little hope as well, because I know that you're a God who loves, and I know that you're a God who takes care of your people. Your mercies are new every day. And so, as well as this lament, Jeremiah pours out this feeling of hope to God as well. Let's turn to Job, and we see another emotion expressed. And every time I read this, I kind of just want to give Job a bit of a hug, because he's really not in a good spot when we find him. Job has just lost everything that he has, his wealth, his family, his health, and at the moment, Job is experiencing absolute grief. We would say it's grief. Grief is when you suffer a major loss. Let's begin in verse 11. Job says this to God. He says, God, why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb? Verse 20. Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter of soul, who long for death but it does not come, and search for it more than hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they can find the grave? Job is going through some intense emotions right here. He's lost everything he's had, and he essentially says to God, God, why do you give life to people who don't even want it? Job says, I'm going to search more intently for the grave than I am for any hidden treasures or anything precious. He goes, my goal right now is to just find the grave as soon as possible. This is Job at his emotionally weakest, most vulnerable, lowest point, and he just cries out to God and expresses this immense grief that he's been expressing, that he's been feeling. And it essentially acts, once again, as this method of catharsis, speaking directly to God. He essentially is releasing himself of this burden of grief that he has been carrying onto. And then just for our final example, let's turn to Exodus chapter 15. Let's end on a more happy emotion that we can express to God. Exodus chapter 15. And this is directly after the Israelites, they've been taken through the Red Sea. They're out of slavery now. And this is how they express the absolute euphoria and joy that they have to God. Beginning in verse 1. Then Moses and the children of Israel sang this song to the Lord and spoke, saying, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. Verse 11. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, glorious in holiness? Verse 17. You will bring your people and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, in the place, O Lord, which you have made for your own dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. The Lord shall reign forever and ever. I love the fact that after going through 400 years of slavery and finally being freed, the Israelites can't help but sing how they're feeling to God. They just can't help themselves. They're feeling this thanksgiving, they're feeling this joy, they're feeling absolute euphoria, and the way that they express it and release this emotions of feeling absolute joy is by singing out to God and thanking him for what he has done. And also, if you just want to look at a few other examples, I'd recommend looking at Habakkuk 1 through 4. Habakkuk has a direct conversation with God, and the emotion that he expresses to God is confusion. And then also, if you want to have another look at Revelation 4:11, we see that once again, people just can't help but sing in absolute awe of God and the qualities that he has. And this is just a small little range of the amount of times we see in the Bible people coming to God and releasing their emotions and telling God how they feel, releasing themselves of these unnecessary burdens. We see anger, we see jealousy, we see hope, and we see pity, we see anxiety, we see praise in victory. We see a whole range of emotions all throughout the Bible. And we see that these people, whenever they're feeling this way, they take these emotions to God and they give them over to him, relieving themselves of the burden that they're carrying. I'd like to also give you some practical ways now to be able to experience this idea of catharsis. All of these are direct biblical examples that we can find, and these are all parts of the way that we can practice this idea, this spiritual discipline of catharsis, dedicating time in a day to just be able to process the emotions that we're going through. The first immediate one, of course, would be prayer. We see, for example, that Jesus, at his most emotionally vulnerable point, at the Garden of Gethsemane, he's so stressed that he's sweating blood. His method of catharsis is to just go to God, and he gives over to his Father everything that he's feeling. May your will be done, God. Again, songs, praise and thanksgiving. We saw this in the Psalms, and we saw this in Exodus 15. Singing to God, or playing music, or listening to music, worship music. Whatever it is that works for you, lifting up our voices in praise and thanksgiving is another way of just releasing ourselves from those emotions. Poetry and writing. We saw Psalms is an example of poetry, but also the Book of Lamentations, an acrostic poem. It's almost as if when you write it down, you're kind of putting what you're feeling onto the page. And so, yeah, poetry and writing is another method. Journaling is another good one. If you want to look for a biblical example of the journal, just look at the Bible. The Bible is literally just a journal of what God has done. Because the journal is just a record of events. And so the Bible stands as the original record of events of what God has done in our lives. This is a discipline that I began to practice at the beginning of this year. I had this amazing answer to prayer, and so I thought to myself, oh man, I can't forget this. So I wrote it down, and then all these other answers to prayers just kept coming and coming. And so gradually I just go, well, I can't forget that either. So I'd write that down, write it down, write it down. And eventually I just decided to incorporate this as a regular practice in my day. At the end of the day, I would just write down what God had done for me. And the good thing is, as well, that it not only helps you as you're writing at that point in time, but it's also very beneficial to then go back and see what God has done in your life. I know I'm really looking forward to reading my whole journal at the end of this year and just see all the different ways that God's been working throughout my life. If you look at Joshua, when they crossed the Jordan River, Joshua says, build an altar, and that altar will serve as a symbol for what God has done for us. And when people see that altar, they will tell all of the stories that God has done. And in the same way, keeping that journal, it's kind of like having that altar. It's a reminder of all the things that God has done for you in your life. Reading the Bible as well. Read the original journal. Read the original record of events. What I find fascinating is that the Bible is not just a record of what God has done for his people, but is also his spoken word to you. And so I think we can find peace when we read the Bible as well. Talking to other people. We saw before that Job, as well as talking to God, Job talks with his friends, but we're also told in the epistles that as a church family, we are to help each other with one another's burdens. If one of us is going through some tough times, or even happy times, we want to be able to tell somebody about what God has done for our life, and we want to be thankful for that. It's important to have those brothers and sisters in the church family to be able to talk to and be able to express to them how it is you're feeling. And this is perhaps the most unique one, visiting a special place. When you look at Jesus, again, at the Mount of Olives, in the Garden of Gethsemane, you actually find out that earlier on in the Gospels, Jesus had already visited the Mount of Olives before. This wasn't his first time visiting the Mount of Olives. And so I find it interesting that in Jesus' most emotionally vulnerable time, he decides to visit a place of significance to him. He decides to go to a place that he and his friends have been to before. He feels comfortable, he feels familiar there, and it's very comforting to visit somewhere of a significance to you. I can personally testify to this one as well. I know living in dorms, it's great, love my dorm, but it's not my home. And so whenever I come back from break, I'll walk into my home and I'll just stand there for a while and go, this is nice. It's nice to be back home. And I know my family think I'm a bit of a goof because sometimes I'll just walk into my room and I won't even walk into the room. I'll just stand in the doorway and just nod my head and smile and go, yeah, this is my home. This is nice. It's nice to be back here. Then I'll probably go stand in the middle of the room for a bit, just keep nodding my head. Yeah, this is good. Then I might lie down on my bed and I'm not even doing anything in my room, but just being there, being at a place that is significant and special to me, helps to relieve all that tension I've been building up all semester. Finally home. Finally back somewhere where I feel familiar, somewhere that is of special significance to me. So these are all methods and these are all different ways that we can experience that catharsis, taking whatever it is to God and letting him take the burdens that we are all carrying. And also, I want you to be able to figure out this discipline, it requires quite a bit of self-awareness. Not all of these methods may work for you. Of course, we should all be praying and reading the Bible. Perhaps talking to other people just isn't for you. Perhaps you prefer to write things down. Find out whatever it is that works for you. Perhaps visiting a special place isn't an option all the time, but being able to sing and have praise and thanksgiving is something that works for you. Catharsis is you expressing your emotions to God. And so your relationship with God is going to be different from everyone else's. So find out which of these methods work for you in your relationship with God. And also figure out which methods work for which emotions. If I'm feeling really angry, I'm probably not going to go and play some hymns. I'm probably not in the right mindset to be playing some nice piano music when I'm angry. Instead, I might listen to some music or write something down or read my Bible. I'll do something else. Or if I'm feeling really confused and really stressed and I've got heaps of different things going on, my immediate instinct normally isn't to go straight to prayer because my mind is just so all over the place. I don't think I could give a coherent sentence, let alone a coherent prayer. So often what I'll do is I'll play some piano for a bit, feel more relaxed, play some hymns, and then following playing the hymns, then I'll go into prayer. I've then made myself at a point where I can use prayer as a method. So I think when it comes to using these methods, it takes a while for us to be able to develop this self-awareness and to be able to figure out which ones work for when, which ones work for you and your relationship with God. But that's something for each of us to then go out and figure out for ourselves. And I think the last thing I want to say about these methods is determine the difference between catharsis and distractions. I don't know if anyone else got this advice during school. I heard it all the time, and when I think about it, it was absolutely rubbish advice. But here's what it was. It was, if ever you feel sad, or if ever you feel X emotion, whatever it is, do something that makes you happy. I did that for a while, and it doesn't work. Because doing something that makes you happy, it doesn't actually deal with the problem that you still have. If you're feeling sad and you do something that makes you happy, all you've done is essentially put a band-aid over the sadness. It's a cosmetic solution. It gives the appearance that you're not sad anymore. So while you could be distracting yourself with something that makes you happy, you could still be processing this sadness. You're still weighed down by this burden of sadness. It's not until we confront that and directly take it to God that we can actually release ourselves of that sadness. And so I think it's important for us to find out what our distractions are as well. I know for me, it would often be reading a book or watching some videos or playing video games, whatever it is. Just any way of being able to escape from whatever it was I was doing there. It worked temporarily, but again, it didn't solve the problem at hand. I still had this problem of sadness. So make sure to be able to practice catharsis and not mistake it with distractions. I want to conclude just by going through some promises that God gives us regarding catharsis. I think it's such an important spiritual discipline that we need to incorporate in our lives. And what I love is that God promises that if we do come to Him, if we come to Him with whatever it is that we're feeling, whatever it is that we're thinking, He promises to take that burden away from us. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that He may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on Him, because He cares for you. And this last one, well, I'll have to read that one out for you. Give me a moment, I'll find that in my Bible so I can read that out for you all. The passage is a bit long, but it is honestly one of my favorite passages in the Bible, and so I'd like to do it justice by reading it in its entirety. Hebrews 4:14 through to 16. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. The invitation is extended to each one of us to come boldly before God's throne of grace. Whatever it is that we're feeling, God invites us to give it over to Him, to give this burden, to find that relief and get that release through healthy catharsis. And so my challenge to all of us this morning is, will we accept that invitation? Will we accept that call to take whatever it is, whatever burdens we are facing, and give them over to God.